So now that I've stitched my garment, I still have one more armhole that is not finished. So I'm going to use a piece of bias to create a bias facing at this armhole. And my bias piece of bias is originally 2 inches wide, and it is ironed into half. So I'm going to go ahead and take this piece and I'm going to begin by folding the edge of it, opening it up, folding the edge of it over just a little bit, and I'm going to begin stitching here at the side seam. And I am stitching my bias from the right side to do this bias facing. Since it's 2 inches wide folded in half, and our seam allowance is 1/2 inch, I'm going to stitch it at 1/2 inch. I'm also going to, when I begin sewing, I'm going to leave that fold open. So I'm going to start maybe like 3/4 inch up, stitching and back stitching. My stitch length is at a normal stitch length, so I'm stitching on the right side of the garment right now. All the way around. And so I am approaching that underarm seam, which is my starting point. I'm going to cut enough bias so that my I can have some overlap. Once I trim that, I'm going to go ahead and sandwich the end of my bias tape into that open fold, just like that. I need to take a little bit off, and I do. Take a little bit more off. So that my raw edge of the bias tape is sandwiched in between both edges of the folded bias. Okay, so once that step is done, I am going to go ahead and take my bias to the iron. I'm going to press all of my seam allowance up towards the bias, and then once I've done that, I'm going to go ahead and understitch at about 1/8 inch just away from that seam. Okay, so now that I have pressed all of my seam allowance up, I'm going to begin that understitch. So I'm starting from the bottom of the armhole, and I'm stitching my seam allowance to the bias facing side, and I'm going to go ahead and do that understitch at about 1/8 inch away from the seam. So I'm trapping all of the seam allowance and the bias tape in one go. once that step is complete and my understitching is done, I can open up the seam allowance and trim away about 1/4 of an inch of the seam allowance all the way around. This will get rid of some of the bulk in the seam, so it'll fit more flush to the body and appear nicer. So you're just cutting away that seam allowance, you are not trimming the bias tape or anything else. Once that's done, I'm now going to take this back to the iron and I'm going to press the bias facing down right on that seam, and then I'm going to go ahead and finish my armhole from the outside. So the bias face should turn completely inside. Okay, so now that my bias face is flipped completely inside the garment, it'll look completely clean. I'm going to add a stitch line catching the outer fold line of the bias facing of that bias tape. So from the outside you'll only see one stitch line, from the inside you'll now see two. So I'm going to begin again with the underarm seam. And begin stitching all the way around my garment. From the outside. So you want to stitch from the right side of the garment and be careful that everything is laying flush and smooth and clean. That my bias facing is completely sewn. The outside of my garment will look like this. So I'll have one stitch line, I'll go ahead and press it, make everything lay smooth. So one stitch line from the outside, here's my neckline, and then on the inside I'll have a double row of stitching going all the way around that binding, attaching it to the inside, so everything is completely cleanly finished.